Hello everyone and welcome to this lesson. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you how to give advice and ask for advice in English. Perhaps you have wondered from time to time, how do you say it in English? Before we begin the lesson, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up if you find it useful. Now, let us begin. So we're going to start the lesson by looking at different phrases that you may use to give advice. From time to time, we have to give advice to our friends, to our colleagues, to our family members, and even to strangers. So, how do you say it in English? The first phrase that you could use when you're giving someone advice is A. If I were you, I would. If I were you, I would. For example, you can say, if I were you, I would call him right now. If I were you, I would call him right now. If I were you, I would not travel tonight. If I were you, I would not travel tonight. If I were you, I would buy a new pair of shoes. If I were you, I would call him immediately. Okay? B. It is better if you. It is better if you. Okay, so you have a friend who's come to you for advice. You can tell them it is better if you. For example, you can say it is better if you find a new job. It is better if you find a new job. It is better if you change your career. It is better if you change your career. It is better if you begin studying next week. It is better if you begin studying next week. It is better if you apply for a place in that university. Okay, C. You should definitely. For example, you can say, you should definitely not call him tonight. You should definitely buy a new car. You should definitely not eat what you are allergic to. You should definitely not eat what you are allergic to. D. The best solution is to. The best solution is to. For example, the best solution is to travel tonight so that you are on time for the meeting tomorrow morning. The best solution is to travel tonight so that you are on time for your meeting tomorrow morning. Or you can say, the best solution is to ignore him. The best solution is to ignore her. E. If I were in your shoes, I would. If I were in your shoes, I would. Or you can say, if I were in your position, I would. If I were in your position, I would. This means that you are basically telling the friend that you're giving advice that if you found yourself in the same problem, if you had that exact same problem, you would. Okay, if I were in your shoes. So if I had the same problem, I would. If I were in your shoes, I would definitely terminate my contract. If I were in your shoes, I would definitely end my contract. If I were in your position, I would speak to my boss. If I were in your shoes, I would speak to my boss. If I were in your shoes, I would call the bank immediately. If I were in your position, I would call the bank immediately. F. The best approach is to. The best approach is to. So here, approach means the best solution, okay? How to go about the problem, how to try to resolve the problem, how to try and find a solution to the problem. So the best approach is to call the bank first and get a mortgage. The best approach is to ignore him. The best approach is to speak to the director about the problem. The best approach is to invest more money in your business. So all those are examples of ways in which you could use that expression. The best approach is to call your mother immediately. The best approach is to make an appointment with your doctor. G. If I were in your place, I would. If I were in your situation, I would. So place here means situation. If I were in your place, I would. Or if I were in your situation, I would. So in other words, if I had the same problem, if I found myself in exactly the same situation, I would. So you could say, for example, if I were in your place, I would terminate my contract. If I were in your place, I would speak to the teacher. If I were in your situation, I would arrange a meeting with her parents. If I were in your place, I would call the company and cancel my subscription. If I were in your place, I would cancel my subscription. Okay, H. Perhaps you could try to. Perhaps you could try to. Or you can say, perhaps you should try to. Perhaps you should try to. For example, you can say, perhaps you could try to speak to him at a later date. Perhaps you could try to speak to her at a later date. Or perhaps you should try to convince him that you're right. Perhaps you should try to convince her that you're right. I suggest that you. I suggest that you. So you could say, for example, I suggest that you never speak to him again. I suggest that you delete his number. I suggest that you never try to call her again. I suggest that you cancel the contract. I suggest that you begin studying for your exams. I suggest that you buy a new car. J. I would never do that because. I would never do that because. Or you could even just say, I would never do that. I would never do that. You know what? I would never do that. So, assuming that your friend or your colleague has come to you with a problem and they have explained to you how they try to resolve the problem, how they try to deal with the problem, and you don't agree with it at all, you can say, I would never do that. Or you can say, I would never do that because I would never do that because I think it's quite stupid. Or I would never do that because I think it's going to be counterproductive. I would never do that because you will not get anything good out of it. I would never do that because I think it's going to cause more problems. I would never do that because it's going to cause a lot of problems. K, you should never settle for that. You should never settle for that. Now, you would use this expression when your friend comes to you for advice and they explain to you that they have already accepted something. Maybe someone has offered them a deal, or maybe someone has treated them in a certain way. Maybe they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend that does not treat them as they should, does not treat them well. So you could say, you should never settle for that. You should never settle for that. Meaning that they should not accept to be treated like that. You should never settle for that. L, I would never accept that, and neither should you. I would never accept that, and neither should you. So here once more, your friend has explained to you that someone has been treating her in a certain way that she does not like, or maybe her colleagues have been treating her or her boss in a way that is not respectful, and she's coming to you for advice. So you can say to her, I would never accept that, and neither should you. Or to him, I would never accept that, and neither should you. M, I'm afraid that, okay? I'm afraid that, for example, you could say, I'm afraid that things will only get worse if you stay there. I'm afraid that things will only get worse if you stay there. Okay? I'm afraid that you will not achieve your goals if you continue behaving like that. I'm afraid that you have been drinking too much and that is going to have a negative effect on your health. I'm afraid that you have made the wrong choice. Okay, so N, you definitely made the right choice. You definitely made the right choice. So you could leave it at that if your friend or your colleague is explaining to you about the choice that they have made and you agree with it, you think it's a good choice, then you can say you definitely made the right choice. Or if you think they made the right choice, but you have a different opinion about it, then you could say you definitely made the right choice, but you definitely made the right choice, but I think you should still call him. You definitely made the right choice, but I think you should try applying to another university. You definitely made the right choice, but I think you should try and find different clients. You definitely made the right choice, but I think you should look into other solutions. Okay? So this brings us to the first section of the lesson. We have looked at a number of expressions, a number of phrases that you could use to give advice. to either your friends, your colleagues, or family members. Now let's move on to the second section of the lesson, where we are going to look at phrases and expressions that you could use to ask for advice. We all need some advice from time to time, okay? So how do you ask for advice in English? How do you say it? A, what should I do? Okay, so you go to your friend, you have a problem, you need some advice, and you can say, what should I do? What do you think I should do? What do you think I should do? What should I do? What do you think I should do? B, what shall I do? What shall I do now? What on earth shall I do now? What shall I do? Okay. C, do you have an idea what I should do? Do you have an idea what I should do? D, how should I best approach this? How should I best approach this? So, you found yourself in a situation and you're quite confused about how to resolve the problem. Okay? You're pretty confused about how you should try and solve the problem. So you can go to your friend and ask, how should I best approach this? So in other words, you're asking your friend to give you some advice on how to go about resolving the problem. What steps should you take to try and solve the problem? How should I best approach this? So what steps should I take to try and solve this problem? E, how should I go about this? Those two, D and E, mean the same. How should I go about this? How should I go about this? So, once more you're asking, what steps should I take to try and solve this problem? How should I go about this? And then F, can you give me some advice? Can you give me some advice, please? Or can you give me some tips, please? Can you give me some tips, please? So here you're specifically asking your friend to give you some advice, some guidelines, some tips on how to go about solving the problem. Some advice on how to best approach the problem. What steps should you take? Can you give me some advice, please? Can you give me some tips, please? Okay. G, what would you do if you were me? What would you do if you were me? What would you do if you were me? So what you're asking your friend here is, if you found yourself in my situation, if you found yourself in my shoes, in my position, if you had the same problem that I have now, what would you do? What would you do if you were me? Okay. H, what would you do in such a situation? What would you do in such a situation? So what you're asking your friend is, if they found themselves in the same problem, in the same situation, what would they do? How would they go about trying to resolve the problem? What steps would they take to try and solve the problem? What would you do in such a situation? And then the last one is I. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Sorry, I forgot the word do between would and I forgot the word do after you. What would you do if you were in my shoes? So it should be, what would you do if you were in my shoes? What would you do if you are in my shoes? So once more, in my shoes here means in my situation. What would you do if you were in my shoes? What would you do if you were in my situation? What would you do if you were in my position? Okay, so what you're asking your friend is, please explain to me, if you found yourself with exact same problem that I have, what would you do? How would you solve that problem? Okay, so this brings us to the last section of the lesson, where I read for you the phrases. If I were you, I would. It is better if you. You should definitely. The best solution is to. If I were in your shoes, I would. If I were in your position, I would. The best approach is to. If I were in your place, I would. If I were in your situation, I would. Perhaps you could try to. Perhaps you should try to. I suggest that you. I would never do that because. You should never settle for that. I would never accept that, and neither should you. I'm afraid that. You definitely made the right choice, but. What should I do? What shall I do? Do you have an idea what I should do? How should I best approach this? How should I go about this? Can you give me some advice, please? Can you give me some tips, please? What would you do if you were me? What would you do in such a situation? What would you do if you are in my shoes? Okay? Now, if you found this lesson useful, please subscribe to the channel. Just hit that red subscription button, subscribe to the channel, and give this video a thumbs up. That will help me grow this channel and continue uploading videos to help you improve in your English. Thank you very much for subscribing, and see you in my next lesson. Bye bye.